Folks, I am honored to be doing an interview with Glenn Steckling. Now, I have to point out to you all, I heard his father a long time ago on the Art Bell show. And I am very familiar with the subject because of the things that I've dug into and my age. And I really am honored to have this gentleman join me because we arranged this very quickly. Glenn, how you doing?
Doing very well, and it's my honor to be able to talk with you and exchange ideas and concepts, and especially to interact with your listeners as well, because this subject has a huge history. There's a lot
Yes.
of it. There's a lot of it that's ignored. There's a lot of it that is exploited and turned upside down and propagandized. And we
Oh
want to
yeah.
take as much opportunity as we can to try to clarify for people so they don't have to feel apprehensive or fearful about visitations from other worlds.
Now, here's the thing that I want people to understand now. Can you explain how you came to be taking care of the George Adamski Foundation?
Yeah, very quickly here. My parents grew up in Europe during the Second World War. They had seen a number of these crafts as our pilots and squadrons, Foo Fighters and saucer shaped and cigar shaped large mother craft, several thousands of feet long, if not longer. And so my father kept a kind of a record of that. And so when he came and immigrated to the U.S. and my mother shortly thereafter, they had seen a number of these craft, and my father was actively pursuing the causes behind it. And
Hmm.
since he was an amateur pilot, and my grandfather was a military pilot that was killed during the war,
Hmm.
my father was aware of the different types of models of makes of aircraft and propulsion and all of this. I mean, it's not any different than me. I mean, I've been flying air. I'm retired now from an airline pilot, and I've been
Hmm.
flying airplanes for 45 years. And so my exposure to the aviation field can identify aircraft at a glance. But what happened is when we went to Colorado Springs, between Denver and Colorado Springs, there were a number of reports of crafts, and we had seen some too. And they are in the records for NICAP, and a couple of them are included in my new book, which will be coming out here in the next 4 to 6 months.
Ah,
And that book is called "Can Truth Prevail?" And we're
nice.
talking about the first half of the book is going to be my family history and chronology of all the activities we partook in. And then the second half deals with specific issues in the UFO field that have been, shall we say, misidentified, and they're causing a lot of problems in it. But anyway, so in 60
Nice.
in Colorado, after seeing these craft, we went to Washington. As I mentioned before to you, we had seen one over downtown Washington in March of '63. It was
Yes.
a saucer-shaped craft about 1,200 feet above the surface, and we were 30 witnesses along with a newspaper reporter on the street watching this. It was reported in the next 2 days in the Washington Daily News. My father
Yes.
went to the Library of Congress, picked up the Adamski book, A for Adamski. There was flying saucers have landed and inside the spaceships. And George had clear, concise telescopic photos of these crafts. And as it turns out, later he also had a motion picture film. And so
Hmm.
my father wrote to George. George was coming in summertime to lecture to the Air Force Reserves. We met him. We became very close and fast friends. And we we worked on arranging his international press conference in the Mayflower Hotel and all kinds of other events. And George introduced us to some of his space contacts. I clearly remember that. We saw a number of craft while in his presence. And so when people make this accusation that George was a hoaxer, they haven't the slightest clue what they're talking about, because the government was parked down at the bottom of the driveway watching us watch them. They were well aware that they needed to keep an eye on us. And so after George passed away in 1965, and he's buried in Arlington National Cemetery,
Yes.
due to his service in the cavalry, 13th Cavalry in the Mexican American conflict of
Mm-hmm.
1917. Um, uh, one of his closest students and heirs, Alice Wells, they were living here in Vista, where I live, and so she got a commitment from my father to help her, because as the elderly ladies were, they couldn't take care of the foundation themselves. And so we went to Mexico for 3 years, a short period of time, where there was a base down there, and that George had told us about, and we had experiences with the Mexican military police and everything that we can all go into at a different time. But when we came back in 72, and then began the process of uh, collaborating our efforts with Alice, and eventually we became the sole inheritors of the copyrights from George and the continuation of the foundation, which we have done to this day.
Yes. Yes. Now, folks, I need to explain to you that Glenn's father, Fred, was on Coast to Coast radio with Art Bell, and that's how I came to know the name and came to know about George Adamski. I admit it.
Well, what happened was is that we went on a European lecture tour in '66, and my
Hmm.
father ended up taking some spectacular UFO footage from the train when we were
Nice.
traveling from Mannheim, and they were flying behind the trees, and he took this footage of them flying and multiplying, and also over the North Atlantic of a large cigar-shaped ship below the 707, which was at least. After that, we got back and we received an invitation from 22 scientists, a panel at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center at Greenbelt, Maryland. And we went
Wow.
there and had interacted with these scientists. These scientists knew all about the ships. They knew about their propulsion. They knew about where they came from, and the type of people that were operating them. And and then shortly thereafter came the invitation from Colonel Freeman at the Pentagon. Anybody who has done any type of research through the 50s after the Washington, D.C. July event in 1952, in which they photographed a number of these ships flying in formation over D.C. and the nation's capital. And the
Yes.
military scrambled their Jeffs, the F-86s, and the Lockheed Shooting Stars, and could not compete with them in speed or maneuverability.
Hmm.
Anyway, the number of the military officers, Colonel Freeman was one of them, along with Captain Ruppelt and Major Burko, and of course the denial that came from the general at that time too when he went on the air. But anyway,
Yeah.
Colonel Freeman looked at the films and looked at the pictures, and he said there's some of the best he's ever seen in civilian hands. We did never
Hmm.
received any ridicule or denial from official agencies, because George's pictures, they were affidavit by the photographic lab as to their authenticity. They were analyzed, both orthographic projection and biometric radiation. And
Hmm.
so these crafts couldn't be models because they were giving out biometric radiation on top of it. And so every decade there has been a litmus test of analysis, and George's pictures have passed every time. The very latest one was about, I'd say about 8 years ago, by a fellow by the name of Rene Olsen in Denmark. His book is called The George Adamski Story.
Hmm.
Excellent book.
Yes, it is.
I collaborated with him. I allowed him access to the original negatives from George,
Nice.
and he did a very minute examination, literally pixel by pixel, of not only the photos but the films. And there's absolutely no doubt of their authenticity. And this book alone has caused a lot of mayhem in the field of debunking, because everybody loves George's pictures, but they never want to give him credit. The last
Yes.
time I saw this disclosure hearings, what was it, in 2000 whatever, they the one of the Paradigm Institute's spokesman is showing these pictures, and they're saying this and this picture by so and so and this picture by so and then they show three pictures from Adamski and they never mention his name because they love to hate him.
Yeah,
And
I
so,
know. I
and
know, and
there's,
it's a
yeah,
shame.
it's a
Now,
shame. Sure.
you know, a lot of people haven't caught on to this, but George himself was courted by the U.S. Air Force and what was the startup of NASA, and so was your father.
Well, what
That is a
happened?
very that was
Hmm.
a very important thing that most people leave out when they're talking about the
Well, because they
foundation and
don't know.
George.
Yes, they don't know. But if you look at the material, you will see that already in the early 50s, and I have the letters and post them as well. And some of them are printed in our book, Behind the Flying Saucer Mystery 2, which came out in 2015. But
Hmm.
these letters are addressed to the Naval Observatory in San Diego, giving them photographs of these objects. The military people would come up to Mount Palomar, up to the property where they were at, and they would often ask him for material. George gave it away freely without charge,
Hmm.
and he submitted it to all avenues of the military. And his attitude was this: I don't need to have credit for this. What is important is the people who have the responsibility for the welfare of the people and citizens of this nation have to have accurate information so they can make legitimate decisions and not
Yes,
decisions based on false information, which we are getting by the
today.
boatloads right now.
Yeah.
That's right. And so he took Eisenhower in 54 out into the desert. He met Eisenhower and at one of the air bases out here in California. And one of these ships landed, and Eisenhower conversed with the people. There were no grays, there were no reptilians. This story has been perverted by
Hmm.
fools in this field who are constantly looking for sensationalism. And there was
Yes.
no deal made for technology in trade for human body parts or genetics or blood or DNA or any of that. That is all garbage. And then
Yes.
George took Kennedy. He was a friend of Kennedy's in 60 during the primary here in California. He invited Nixon and Kennedy to visit him. Nixon declined. Kennedy came down with one of the Congress people, and they talked, became good friends. And George was given a White House access card, and we've
Hmm.
seen it in his wallet. He showed us to us, and he had access to the underground facilities because the major entrances is for the public relations. But there's a
Yes.
huge amount of underground accesses to the White House in which people and personnel go back and forth. They don't want to be under observation.
Hmm.
And so George went there on several occasions and briefed the president. He also met Kennedy and his brother out here again in Palm Springs and what was Hot Springs at that time, Desert Hot Springs. They got in the car, drove to a different military base not too far away, and another one of these craft landed, and the same kind of interaction happened. So George was not playing games with this subject, and he was very much uh, uh, authorized in order to give the right information to the right people because we came tenaciously close to nuclear annihilation,
Yes.
right, during the Cuban Missile Crisis and
Yes.
one other time. And it is true that our space visitors have stepped in twice to de-escalate what would have gone into nuclear conflict. And in fact, if you look at astronaut Edgar Mitchell, I believe that's Apollo 17,
Hmm.
Edgar Mitchell just made a statement about 3 months ago, and that statement said that the space people had come in and helped de-escalate several nuclear conflicts, which we would not have survived. So it's not
Hmm.
like the truth isn't out there. It is. It's just you got to know what you're talking about, and you got to know where to look.
Well, you can't walk around with blinders on either. And a lot of people come to their own conclusion and only seek information that supports that conclusion.
Well, that's true, and also there is unfortunately, in the beginning, it was the government and the military that sequestered and squashed this information. But
Yes.
after the 1970s, yeah, I remember we were visited by a CIA operative, and he said, "You know, we don't have to deny this stuff as much anymore because the UFO community has become such a plethora of misinformation within itself that we
Yes.
no longer have to worry about confusing the public. They're doing a good job of it themselves.
Well, what do you think about the we won't name names, but what do you think about the current CIA multiple operations that have been going on for the last few years in order to even muddle the situation more? Do you think that's related to a higher number of visitations like we had in the 70s?
Well, what I think is it's multiple. George made a statement before he passed away, and that was the only way that we would ever partially recognize extraterrestrial intelligence is if we can make it into a national and global threat, right? Like Reagan said, in his
Yes.
UN speech, the same thing. How quickly we would come together if a threat from space was something that we were deadly worried about. And so what happened is we have the powers that be have taken this subject and metamorphosized it into a fear-based threat.
Yes.
And we have moved from a petroleum based world economy now to a great deal, at least 50-50, of military industrialized economy, in which the
Mhm.
production of war materials and the usage of war materials is instigated around the globe in
Lost your audio there for a second. I still don't have your audio, Glenn.
1 2 3 1 2
There you
3.
are. There you are.
Okay.
So they've instigated this military industrial.
Right. This an economy. Thereby, they are pulling ourselves out of the economic disaster that we have with trillions and tens of trillions of debt, which cannot be sustained. And
No.
they keep just pushing it along, hoping that the people are going to be too stupid to not understand what that means. And
Mhm.
so, by making the extraterrestrial concept now a global threat or the implications of it. And there's not a day I don't pick up some type of media release that doesn't talk about the threat now of
Yes.
UFOs, right?
Yes.
And so this way we can use our economies now to weaponize and militarize the entire planet and maintain the system that we are accustomed to. Remember, as I tell the people so often, that we are as much to blame as the people whom we accuse of manipulating us because
Yes.
we allow this to happen and we don't that we say we want change but we really don't, because if you tell the person that if we change it's going to affect the stock market, the global economies, the employment situation, the retirement and 401k, when it becomes a personal uh, implication, then the
Yes.
people don't want anything of it. As long as somebody else has to make the change, then they're all for it.
Well, it's that thing, not in my neighborhood.
That's right.
I mean,
That's
it's awful.
exactly it.
It's awful. So now we had your family were experiencers as well. I don't know any other term to use. So you grew up with exposure to seeing the UFOs and these other objects in the sky. All right, we lost
Of
your audio again.
1 2 3 1 2
Yep,
3.
there we go. We'll
Okay.
just do it the way we'll
Yeah.
we'll
Well,
we'll fight through this. I think we're having solar effects right now,
we
so
may. I don't know. I have a
it will
I
definitely
have
affect
a
us.
I have cable modem, so I don't know. Sometimes it is. Who knows? But
Yes.
anyway, the what was I going to say here?
Well,
The
what I had said was is your family had experienced this for a long time as
right,
well. We're
right.
meeting George.
Right. So what happened was is that I remember one occasion specifically where we were. He said to me, he said, "I have two of our friends coming to visit us, and these are space people, and we're going to sit on the dining room table. We're going to have a conversation, and you are going to just be quiet and listen." And that's exactly
Nice.
what I did.
I
I was accustomed to that as a child already. I had an upbringing that actually had some discipline and some
in the military.
oversight.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so they came and they would, because you have to remember that in order for George to take these films and these photos, he had to be made aware of when to be ready in order to take it successfully.
Yes.
Right. And so they would say, okay, on this day at this and this time from this direction we'll be coming, you be ready with your camera so you can take this. It's not like today where everybody holds up a cell phone camera. In the old days you carried around a big heavy bulky 8 or 16 millimeter camera,
Yep.
and you better knew how to use the thing. And so
Absolutely.
these were always arranged with George so that he was cognizant of it happening beforehand so he could get some quality material to show to the public and to the officials. And so George introduced us to some of his space contacts. We carried on those relationships after George passed away. A couple of them came to the Mayflower Hotel, where my father was an executive chef, and helped him in the nights write his first book called "Why Are They Here? Spaceships from Other Worlds." And
Hmm.
so, there were many circumstances upon which we had interaction with them, and so, that continued for a number of years, but I would have to honestly say I think the last time I've seen one of them was about, well, maybe 15 years ago.
Yeah.
But time isn't the same for them as it is for us. They look the same as they did in 1960, where I look all old and haggard. They
Wow.
have a different type of lifestyle that's free of stress and free of complications, and so their age
Well, and
is.
all the toxins we're exposed to as well.
That's correct. All the toxins and all the greatest destroyer of our human form and our health is stress. And that
Yes.
stress comes from inside, whether we self-generate it or whether it's generated from our ambitions and our desires to have things and willing to do anything to get it. The willingness to use other people, and our word doesn't mean anything. The space people find us very unusual and complex because we are never what we say to be. We cannot be trusted. Most people cannot. They would sell out in a heartbeat. The CIA came to my father and offered him $1 million in the 60s, tax free in any kind of account overseas he wanted, if he would denounce George Adamski. And my father politely told them to kiss his behind. But
Nice.
how many people in this field, especially now, we don't even want to
Yeah.
go there,
Exactly.
wouldn't sell somebody else out or throw somebody under a bus for personal gain?
I want to share a story with you, and I want your take on it because of your experience, and then we're going to go into George and some of the other stuff. A few years ago now, I had been doing stand-up comedy, and I had been doing a lot of gratuity speeches for a very long time. I started in the late '80s, and when my wife passed in 2006, I just quit. I went into the basement and hid
Hmm.
because I had been talking for all those years about what we were seeing with government and politics and corporations and the military industrial complex, and I was just burnt out, and my wife had passed and I was pretty much done. Well, 2.5 years ago I was down by the river where I like to take my break at work, and I was smoking a cigar, and I felt something looking at me. You know that thing you get in the back of your head?
Oh, yes. Hmm.
I felt something looking at me, and I turned around and looked right up the trail, and I knew I was looking at whatever was looking at me, but I could not see anything. But I knew right where it was at. I could feel it. Well, then there was a breeze, and some of the underbrush, this time of year, some of the underbrush, there's berries and things there, moved. And I saw an outline of a person. And the only thing I can describe it to you as is the same kind of camouflage that you see in the Predator movies.
Right. Okay. Well, here's an
Now,
answer for you.
here's here's something I need to tell you though. The minute that one took off and vanished from my sight, I saw two others that were fairly large. Two females, one male. I could tell by the outlines of them. But here's the thing: after that encounter, I started doing my podcast again.
Well, see,
I
you
just knew
needed a
I just knew I had to.
right. You needed a little bit of reminder. of something that you had let go, perhaps prematurely, and it was time to pick up the baton again. The space people, my father asked them, he says, this is a violent planet and people are unpredictable. How do you protect yourselves? Because the space people will not, uh, they will not take your life to protect their own.
Yes.
They are truly brothers keepers in every sense of the word. And so they are defensive. And he says, well, one way is, of course, we can read people's thoughts. And as we walk down the street, we become aware that around the corner somewhere, some kind of a allocation is happening. And so we maneuver ourselves away from it. So we basically don't put ourselves in that position. However, we wear a device that's about the size of a cigarette lighter. And this device bends light rays. It uses Einstein's unified field theory. And what happens is that when it's activated, it bends the light rays around them. So you're looking at them. Those light rays, or those rays that come from your eyes that go out and bounce back and go to your cornea so you can see in your brain, because it's
Yes.
actually your brain that sees, not your eyes.
Yes.
But those light rays just bend right around and keep going. So what happens is that the object that it is camouflaging becomes invisible to your sight, but it is still physically there. You can
Hmm.
you can hear it, you can touch it. It is there is no of this interdimensional shape-shifting fantasies from the science fiction community. It's just a natural scientific device that they have developed. They use it for their ships. So when the ships suddenly become invisible, that's because they're bending the light rays around them, or they're moving so fast that your eye cannot track it. I think your eye's limitation is about 4,000 frames a second, and they can move much, much faster than that. So what appears to disappear is simply moved. So my father said, oh, we'd like to see that in action sometime. So my mother, father, and I are walking along 17th Street between the back entrance to the Mayflower and the National Geographic building. And towards us comes walking one of these space friends carrying his laundry basket. And he gets about, oh, I'd say about 8 yards from us. He waves at us and we wave at him and he suddenly disappears. And then we
Wow.
can hear him walking past us. We can hear his footsteps as it walks past us, and we all swivel around following the sound. And about 5 yards afterwards, he reappears, waves happily again, and marches off his own direction. So we got a demonstration of how that device works, and then maybe that's some of the explanation for the situation that you experienced.
I knew if I asked you that you would be able to explain it, and a lot of folks are going to go like, "What?" But that's the second time I experienced that. The first time I experienced that, I was only 12,
Hmm.
and I sat down on a stump to have a cigarette, and when I blew out the smoke, it went around somebody who was standing there that I couldn't see.
Right.
Um, so I wanted to bring that up with you because I knew that there were references to this in other places, but I knew from George and your experiences, somewhere in there you would have a reference. Um, do they tend to visit people?
Yes. What they do is that they have they have a Peace Corps system, sort of, in which a number of them come to study and learn amongst us. And for a 2 year period, approximately, they come and they take whatever job is available to them. One means of employment or one means of a job is not any more or less like we have such biases and discrimination. Oh, you're a doctor, you're a garbage people, blah, blah, blah. And of
Yeah.
which they've realized long ago that none of the society could function if everybody didn't participate in doing what was needed to be done. And so
Hmm.
they take a job. I knew one that was a park ranger in Washington. In fact, my mother and I ran into him several times. One at the State Department, one at the administration, one at the local religious theology institutions. And so there were a number of them. And so one of the scientists asked my father, he says, how many people from other planets do you think are walking amongst us? And my father grinned, took a piece of notepaper and wrote down a number. The scientist wrote down his number. They exchanged papers, and they were basically the same number within a very small margin. And so it shows that we know what's going on, and it shows that we are aware that they're not monsters or reptiles or crayfish or Sasquatch or whatever,
Yeah.
because they walk amongst us. They look like us. They behave like us. They speak like us. They learn our languages. That is, they're not their primary mode of communication, but they it's not any different than when our Peace Corps people pack up and go to somewhere in the other part of the world. We become part of that environment, and we live with those tribes and help those people the best we can, and then
Yes.
we go about our business. And so um, they understand that they may be thousands of years ahead of us technologically and sociologically, because they have invested that time and made the proper decisions instead of the destructive ones that we continually do. But they
Mhm.
understand that they have come from a source like we have. And for them to visit us and see how we behave and how we go about things is in a way allowing them to see how they were in the past. There's no such thing as time travel. That's a fantasy. But you can go to a place where the environment represents how something was in the past. If I pack up and go into Manaus in the middle of the Brazilian jungle, and I encounter the native tribes that are there, I am encountering how people lived many thousands, if not tens of thousands of years ago. I
Yes.
haven't I haven't gone and I haven't traveled through time. I'm simply experienced a place where that expression still exists. And
Yes.
so we get so confused, we get so um, enamored with science fiction that we have replaced fact and reality with fiction. And in fact, not too long ago, many years ago, a decade ago or something, I remember reading an article where it said that theory will now become accepted as fact until proven otherwise wrong. Well,
Yeah, and that's backwards.
how in the world can that be?
That's backwards. Science was
There-
always designed to prove yourself wrong.
Well, there you go. It would be like saying everybody's guilty until proven innocent. It's absolutely backwards.
Well, they're trying that now, right?
Oh, they're not trying, they're doing it.
I know, I know. So let's start. Let's go backwards now. Can you tell people about George's books?
Yeah. Originally, when George started to take these photographs, I give you a brief history. George was gifted a 6-inch telescope in 1938. And then in
Hmm.
1940, he moved out of the city towards the Mount Palomar direction. And in 1945, one of the son of the person who gifted him the telescope became a scientist at Caltech.
Uh
And
huh.
Dr. Joseph Johnson was responsible for the sky mapping location for the eventual construction of the 200-inch Hale telescope that's on top of Mount Palomar. So
Yes.
Doc, Dr. Johnson told George, listen, you should go to the base of the mountain because there's more activity going on there, not only for the astronomical construction, but the scientists and what have you. So George moved there. They set up the telescope. They took pictures, and the pictures became famous around the world. In
Hmm.
1953, he released a book with Lord Desmond Leslie in England. And if you're aware of Castle Leslie, that's a
Hmm.
famous historical site in Ireland, a family seat for the Leslie family. And Desmond Leslie wrote about the Indian Vihanas, like you mentioned earlier. And in fact, he did the whole half of the first book about those historical records. Yet, not one single program, whether it's Ancient Aliens or any of the other ones, when they address the ancient Indian texts and these crafts, they do not mention Leslie at all. It's like he never existed. Yet, he was the one, along with Lord Mountbatten and Lord Dowden, who arranged for the lecture tours in England for George in 1959. So these were not fly by night people by any stretch of the imagination. Flying Saucers Have Landed came out in 1953. This is the account of George's contact with the ship that landed out in Desert Center, California, which is between Palm Springs and Blythe on the way to Phoenix. And the second half of that book recalls the entire experience along with the other 6 witnesses and the Project Blue Book report of the craft being seen by military aircraft as well. All of that was in the newspapers as well, and that was in that first book. The second book in 1955 was Inside the Spaceships, in which George described being picked up by his space friends and taken into orbit, flown around the moon. He talks about lunar atmosphere, lunar gravity, water on the moon, and so on and so forth. All things that we have proven in recent years. And in fact, my father's book, We Discovered Alien Bases on the Moon, is a collection of NASA photos directly from their archives that show clouds and mists, and the records that we have that tell you that that's what they've been seeing, and astronauts have been seeing too. And so the things that George described, the firefly effect in space that John Glenn reported in 1963, these were all done by George almost a decade before our space program. So that's why the officials came to him, and he counseled them on many times. They said the first thing when they started sending the satellites out after Sputnik, and we shot ours off about a month and a half later, we started getting erroneous data from our satellites that the temperature on the Earth was upwards of 1,800 degrees. And so George said, hey, you're just bouncing off the ionosphere. That's the normal filter around all planets. And so if you take the instrumentation and wrap it inside multiple hulls of the satellite, like a thermos bottle, you then prevent it from being impacted by solar radiation and all this other stuff, which they did, and it worked out fine. And so like I said, George's contribution, I would say there was an article that once said George Adamski, first ambassador to space. I'd have to say that's a true statement.
Yes. So now, your father's books came out in the 70s, right?
My father's first book, Why Are They Here? Spaceships from Other Worlds, came out in 1969.
69.
And it was printed by Vantage Press. I still have a couple of boxes of those original paperbacks available. They're kind of collector's items now. But and then we went to Mexico, and because George had told us of the general vicinity of a space base there, so we purchased some property, and we went there for 3 years. The second week after we arrived, the Mexican military showed up, and so they drove all around the property. It was a large ranch, probably about, I don't know, 60 acres or maybe something like that. And they went around with metal probes and metal detectors covering the whole spectrum of the property, while the commandant was sitting in the living room with my father looking through the window. And so my father said, you make me very happy, because you wouldn't waste your time if you didn't think we had something there for you to find. But I can assure you that if I had a spaceship, I would have left this crazy planet a long time ago. And so the commandant pointed to one of the George's pictures that was hanging on the wall, and he says, we know they're here. We know where they come from. We know they're good for us, but we don't want them. So he told my father, we received a abbreviated dossier from the Pentagon about you, and we know what you're about and what you're doing and all of that. And you will be allowed to stay in this country only as long as you don't go amongst the people and attempt to educate them. So anyway, so yes, that. And then in the 70s, when we were back here in the U.S., my father had some contacts to write to, and was able to acquire first generation copies of the original pictures taken by the lunar orbiter and by the Apollo and what have you. And they came in microfiche and catalog. And then you take the numbers and you order the pictures. You have to pay for them, and then you get the pictures. And so I got a whole safe full of the 15 by 11 Apollo Hasselblad pictures that show activity on the moon. And we
Nice.
had to go through the picture by picture with magnifying glass and microscope in order to see a number of things. And then we made that available in the book. We discovered alien bases on the moon, which I updated in 1997.
Nice.
And I make those pictures available whenever I go on the air. Like for instance, on some programs I do, we share screen, and then I pull up the file so people can see the photos for themselves. And so I
Now,
always make that available as well.
while I'm thinking about this, are these books available from your foundation site?
Yes, if you
All
go
right.
to a if you go
Good.
if you go to Adamski Foundation, one word.com, you will find the foundation site, and one of the pages is called Available Materials, and you'll see it there. We are also available on Amazon, on ABE Books, and also on eBay. So those three outlets, you will find the books available there. And it's interesting because I sell the original books I see on eBay. I sell the book, I think, what, for $22, and there are people who have bought books from us and are trying to sell them upwards of $50 to $150. I said, my God, what is going on here?
See, folks, now the reason why I brought that up is because if you are interested in the works that are available from the foundation, please go to the foundation site and pay them directly. Um, it's so much more efficient, and it keeps other organizations from getting their cuts, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
Now,
that's true.
so we come up through the 70s, and in 1973, here in the United States and around the planet, as a matter of fact, we had a swath from North Carolina to California, all over Europe. We had a huge influx of sightings, including on the ground. We had an on the ground sighting here in North Carolina in 1973.
Mm.
Do you think that was related to the Kennedy issues and what was going on at the time?
Well, there were a number of sightings, as you know. Gulf breeze happened during that time. The Tuscaloosa, Mississippi incident happened at that time. Also, there was the reports of a acorn-shaped craft that crashed in the woods. I can't remember whether it was in Virginia or Carolina, um, but I can say that most of these were all our stuff. What has happened is that since we have recovered some alien technology, and that technology has been openly used to develop some things like we have, like transistors and computers and night vision and all this. There's a whole list, a plethora of scientific advancements that we have become accustomed to today that has come downstream of the discovery of materials from these crafts. And so we have developed our own craft that are not entirely using the same propulsion system because we're not understanding it as well. The closest in understanding we have came to was Tesla's coils and Tesla's power tower. This is using electrostatic or the energy that the planet itself, since it's a giant dynamo, a giant Van de Graaff generator, produces hundreds of trillions and trillions of volts of electricity.
Exactly.
And and so these type of sightings were our research and development craft since we were out experimenting with them. That's the same thing that happens in Area 51. We are using a combination of different technologies and building and experimenting, but the majority of the real work is no longer happening in Area 51. It has moved already 30 years ago away up to Alaska. But the government's not
Yes.
stupid. They know that if they shut down the base totally, then people stop seeing things, they will start looking elsewhere. This way,
Yes.
they're still enamored with the same location and they're still sitting on top of the sand hills watching. And that doesn't mean they don't see anything. I think there's, and
All
I'd
right.
say these days, about 60 to 65% of what is viewed is our own research and development, plus the development of lowercase aerodynamics like drones and ROVs, and these the hypersonic, the Aurora, and the other crafts that go supposed to go to Mach 10.
Don't get me wrong. I think the X-41 Phantoms that the Navy have are amazing, and I think the TR-3Bs are fantastic, but they do not fall into the same classifications.
No, they don't. Anything that is triangular shaped or delta winged is us. It's not extraterrestrial. You cannot operate a craft at light speed or faster that has appendages or rough edges onto it. It has to be either circular, lenticular shaped, or cigar shaped. So anything that has pods hanging down or appendages hanging off the surface or delta winged or triangular, those sightings that happened over Phoenix that people are still ranting and raving about, that's our own stuff. That isn't extraterrestrial.
Yeah. Well, and people also aren't aware of the Raytheon and McDonnell Douglas massive dirigibles that have been built over the last 15 or 20 years either.
Sure, that's
And
true.
those have the LED skins, which means that they can hide or
Mm-hmm.
project. But now people are going to get mad at me if I don't ask. So it's coming. So
Go for it.
where did George say that these people were from?
Okay. Well, this is the contention point that George had interaction with people that reside in this solar system.
Yes.
Now, it doesn't mean only, because George talked about people from Alpha Centaurus and Wolf 359 and other star systems that are close within 10 or 11 light years of us, which people have come to visit us too. But let us make a very clear point. There are races of people who are visiting us, not species. The reptile does not crawl out of the swamp and start building microcomputers. The whale does not suddenly walk on the sand and build 747s. We are once again enamored with the Star Wars bar scene in which any creature that your imagination can stick pieces to is going to be what has to come from space. And that shows us that we are incredibly ignorant on how life is formed and progresses. Any biochemist, and there was a very famous one, Dr. Cyril Panampur, who wrote the Principles of Life, and he, amongst with the laboratories in Maryland, and among many people, the Ames Research Center for NASA said that the chemistry for life, the amino acids, the elements, all that which makes us what we are, comes from the womb of space. And these materials are raining down on our planet and every other planet by the tune of several tons since the creation of their existence billions of years ago. So we have a two-tiered system where we had originally denied the spacecrafts and the extraterrestrial crafts were coming and there was intelligent visitation. Well, when we finally got off our butts and went into space, we could not tell the people what the true conditions are either, because that would negate the fact that they had lied about the previous phase one of denying their existence to begin with. If you look at a Mariner 10 shot, there is one picture from Mariner 10 of the planet Venus. And I'm going to find a way to show this to you, probably through email. And it shows a planet that has bands of swirling white clouds with big areas of blue patches underneath it and two polar ice caps. Now, if the planet Venus was 800 degrees Fahrenheit, if the density of the atmosphere was 6 times boiling oil, and if the wind was 400 miles an hour, how in the world would you have polar ice caps? How in the world would you have jagged mountains and topography like the Alps? And all of that would be sandblasted, smooth as a marble. And the biggest question is, how in the world would you land a parachute there?
Exactly. Now, I have to point out to somebody else too. Something else that was seen is the harvesters in the rings of Saturn.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people aren't even aware of that.
No, because there's this is a field in which you have to dig tenaciously. When you look at an article like the so-called disclosure article that was released by the intelligence fellow there that testified, I looked through that article and I found right away 10 areas of discrepancies. And I know for a fact that once you sign those secrecy acts, they
Hmm.
are for life. They are
Yes.
not rescindable. You do not, if the Pentagon, if you have something to say, the Pentagon vets it. And if
Yes.
they agree to what you say, they will allow you to say it. But if they agree to what you say, you know already from the get-go that all of it isn't true.
Exactly. And a lot of people miss the fact that everything that was said in those hearings had already been vetted.
That's right.
But
Absolutely. And
so
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 what
now,
happens is going back to this original thing that the planets, some of the planets in our solar system are inhabited, and of course some of the planets in the other systems that are closest to us are inhabited too, comes from the observations of the space people who have been traveling space for tens of thousands of years, and they have stated that they have found the human genome to be universal no matter where they went. So people abide an abode no matter where we go in the cosmos.
well,
And
it's really funny because people who claim Christianity ignore that statement. I have many flocks that you know not of.
in my father's house there are many mansions. Yes, that's true.
And
Absolutely. Jesus said it, Buddha said it, Confucius said it. So many of the ancient sages said it. The same basically 7 to 10 principles taught by all of them are coming exactly from the same template because these
yeah,
are lessons that we are need to learn in order to not annihilate ourselves.
yes, yes. I mean, humans are extremely self-destructive, even individually. But as a
Mm.
group, it can become even. What's that old saying? Never underestimate the power of large numbers of people. What is it? Large
Well,
group of
that's well, like they say, the more people that agree to it, the more you have to question it. I mean,
absolutely, absolutely.
y-
So now, excuse me. I love sitting outside when I'm talking to folks because it's just a whole different energy. But sometimes the pollen gets to me.
oh
Um,
yeah.
so now, the folks that George had been speaking to, they were from Venus.
Venus, Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter.
Wow. Or now, were these the same folks that your parents interacted with too?
Yes, these are the same people that we interacted with. There were some new ones that came over time. Um, it wasn't always the same individuals because thankfully they have lives to live too, and they get to go home. They get a round trip ticket while the rest of us are stuck here. And so yes, these were individuals that we uh, encountered and associated with, and so I have no reason to doubt them. If somebody if somebody comes through the millions of miles of space and lands and says, "Hello, I come from so and so," I'm not going to be the ones that say, "What? That can't be. You're a liar. You can't be living there." I mean, come on. I mean, when let's face a very basic fact. When it comes to information beyond this planet, we don't know anything. We are
I tell
total
you,
we are
it's hard to.
total
I was going to say
right?
it's hard to see the ant farm when you're inside of it.
Well, we don't know anything but theory
Yes.
because we don't actively go to places in order to expose discoveries. We go to places in order to collect data to keep that sequestered to a very few, and the rest
Hmm.
of the people don't get to know much of anything that's going on.
Well, and that's so different with the culture of East India because everybody over there, if you said, "Oh, well, there's UFOs," and they go, "Yes, of course."
Well, that's the same thing as well. Let's use the Native American. If you ask the Native American peoples, do they believe in reincarnation? They said, of course we do.
Yep. And we
And
also talk about our Sky Brothers.
that's right. Your Sky Brothers exactly the same. And right, and so we have a way of demeaning those people by calling them simple-minded or too natural or whatever. Well, the reverse is that we have become, the rest of us, so complicated and so what we call intellectually academic, we can't
Mhm.
see our own behind for the trees.
True. Now, I wanted to bring up something because, Rudolf Steiner always talked about the generations of peoples that inhabited Venus and Mars and Saturn and Jupiter and on out. And he always said that it was a progression of advancement, both spiritually and scientifically.
That's a
Um,
correct
they
statement. Yes.
they had found a balance between spiritualism and materialism.
They had found that that science and religion were one and the same.
Exactly.
And so there's no fight between them. And so the more they travel and the more they explore, the more they encounter the magnificence of creation or the creative intelligence. It just inundates you with the magnificence of creation, of no matter where you go. And so they have this reverence for the creative intelligence or God or whatever you want to call it.
Mhm.
And science works together with that. Like, for instance, we are constantly trying to find a way to overcome the powers of nature rather than blend with them. Many,
Yes.
many years ago, an engineer found by studying the shells of the Nautilus how to replicate that and develop a pump that was 100 times more efficient than anything we had ever developed beforehand.
I remember this.
Right? And we so we have now allowed science to run rampant with their imaginations. And they say, well, let us create antimatter.
Uh,
And so the question is, if nature produces so much power and electricity, why would I work to develop the same amount of power to negate it and
exactly.
then have to duplicate it again to recreate more power? That
We
it makes no sense.
do the have the visitors ever spoken of this negative. I don't know what you want to call it. This negative mentality or negative entity that seems to overshadow so many people here.
Well, they have, just like the past sages of the past, they have taught that we are the only creation that has a choice. Right? For instance, all of nature, no matter how sophisticated it is within its own phylum, let's say the whale is the most intelligent in the ocean, but it cannot make a choice to leave the ocean and become something else. We are the only ones given the so-called power of choice. And unfortunately, we have not recognized that part of us is ego and part of us is divine intelligence. And so we on this world are the proponents of ego. Give me more. I need this. Ambition, this. Competitiveness, this. Capitalism, this. We spend an entire lifetime chasing the things that are going to satiate an unsatiable ego.
Yeah.
And that is why we live the destructiveness that we do. And until we learn to embrace, well, look at the Native Americans. They embraced the Great Spirit. They didn't believe that the land was theirs or anybody else's. It was there, created for all to have benefit of. They lived not always peacefully because they fought each other like crazy too sometimes,
Yes.
but Um, but I think that if you read the book He Walked the Americas, you may enjoy that a great deal.
Hmm.
And and you will find that there are many who have come amongst us to help teach us the betterment of things. And the problem is that as soon as that influence leaves, we revert back to what we believe we are. And we are convincing people now. We are telling them, well, being nasty is who you really are. Being greedy is who you really are. We're telling people that all the negative aspects of character is what we are, and all the good things is what we aren't. So we are compounding and reinforcing more stupidity than anything else.
Steiner warned about this, coming out of the East Indian traditions the way that he did. He warned that the materialism was going to try to subdue the spiritual.
Of
And
course.
100 years later, look at what we're seeing around us.
Hmm.
Um,
Well, that is true.
I have one more question, and I appreciate your time, and I know you'd probably go a little bit longer, but I don't want to keep you because uh, I know it's.
Well, you use as much time as you want. I have
Are you
time available.
overwhelmed?
What was
Folks, you got to understand, he and I are 3 hours different here, so I didn't want to encroach on his evening. But now, did the folks ever talk about our cyclical issue that we have with the solar flares and flashes?
Yeah, what happens is that the the changes that we see on our planet are twofold. One of them is the natural cycle. There's a 26,000 year cycle for the planet, an 11,000 year polarity change cycle for the sun, and there are other cycles as well. What is happening is we're going through a geophysical change. The word global warming is a total misnomer because people are too ignorant to understand that's not what it means. The global physical changes are the warmer areas get colder, the colder areas get warmer, and it redistributes the weather cycles and the jet streams, and the entire planetary climate starts to change.
Hmm.
Part of that is natural, and part of it is accented by our own input into it. So, for instance, nature tries to maintain a balance,
Yes.
and it always tries to return to that balanced mode. But if we nudge it a little further than it was intending to have to balance, then we start to get consequences. So the
Yes.
changes on this world are the same changes that are going through on other worlds, and the sun is in the process of deterioration. This solar system is on its way out. Yeah, no one can say whether it's today, tomorrow, next year, or in 100 million years, but it is in its downward cycle, which is a normal part of nature.
Yes.
And so what happens is once the sun goes supernova, a black hole is created, and all the material from the solar system and all the planets and all the asteroid belts get sucked into that black hole and torn apart. The molecules are decharged, and so that the elements and the atoms all come apart. They go through the black hole, become recharged, and are spit out the other side as material that is going to go to build the new solar system. And the whole process starts again. And so we are in the process of these changes, and you can see it in the planet. The amount of volcanic activity, there are some anywhere from 30 to 50 active volcanoes that we know about, earthquakes.
Oh yeah. Well, and there's a lot of things that have been written about these cycles. Even from the East Indians and from Native Americans, we have stories about these cycles.
Sure, the
And
Great Flood. Hmm.
so we and then we have the Mayan cultures and the Aztec cultures that talk about the jaguar eating the sun and then spitting it back out. Um,
Yeah.
the Hopi's four worlds. That means that this place has been pretty much cleaned off about four times. Um, so with me, I always wondered if George or your father or you had ever had a conversation that came about talking about these cycles, because for our people, it said that the last time that the Great Cycle happened, the Sky Brothers came, took some away, and protected them for I don't know how long, I guess through the Ice Age, and then brought them back when it was safe.
That's true. I would say that it's saying that took is not a very good word to use. What they did is they came and they offered those who were willing to leave the opportunity to go. They never
Mm.
take you anywhere. The abduction, whole
Uh,
abduction,
State those who were able, those who were willing, went.
yeah, yes,
They weren't taken as in abducted. You all. I don't want to. I don't want to confuse our traditional story.
that's
Those
correct.
those who were willing and were willing to be gone and know that they weren't going to be able to come back in their lifetime. Um,
That's true. And the space people have also said that should these cataclysmic changes come again, that whatever spare ships they have, they will come and land and they will simply open the door. They're not going to be calling to you. They're not going to be trying to take care of your insecurities. They will open the door. And for those who walk in, they will go. And for those who stay here, well, that's going to be the end of that. So,
well, you know,
that, and that is why this whole notion of scaring the hell out of the people with the abduction nonsense is
uh,
so vile, because it is literally endangering everybody.
well, and for me, my great grandmothers were born in the 1890s, so that'll tell you.
Yeah,
Excuse me, everybody. Sorry about that. But my great grandmothers were born in 1889 and 1891, and they told me that as one person remembered that the Sky Brothers were there to help, that they would come to help.
that's
And
right.
I have never forgotten what I was told.
Mm, good thing.
But there are so many things and so many questions because of your experience and the lifetime that you've had with this. Um, we know that they walk amongst us. That has never been denied. There have been some convolutions of this as far as their violence and abducting people and this and that and the other. But I have always been told that they could stand beside me in a crowd and I would not even know that they were there.
You could, or if your senses were aware, you would then pick up their proximity, their vibration, their awareness, and then you would turn around and suddenly look right at them, and when you look them in the eye, you will be able to tell. And so you remember that they have technology that is thousands of years ahead of us. They can sit in the comfort of their ships up in orbit. They can record you all the way down to your thoughts, your atomic structure, your entire anatomy. All this thing can be done with their technology. The idea that they have to come down and swipe you and then carve you up like a head of beef at the butcher yard is just absolutely ludicrous.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I have to ask you a question. Have you ever seen the ones with the purple irises?
No, not that I can recall. No.
I was in a crowd one time, and I just had this. It was almost this empathic, emotional thing. It wasn't really words. It was just I felt something, or someone was trying to get my attention, and I turned around and I looked right at this beautiful girl who was blondish, about as tall as me, and I'm 6'1", and she had purple irises. It just floored me, and I said, "You're not from here, are you?" And she smiled at me, and she goes, "No."
Well, there you go. That answers your question.
Um, and I've had that happen to me a few times over the years. Just, "You're not from here, are you?" "No." And everybody standing around us would have thought I meant, like not from North Carolina or not from Atlanta or wherever I happen to be. But that's not what I meant, and they understood it.
That's right. Exactly right. They will never. Everybody always says, "Well, why don't they come forward and divulge themselves?" I mean, that would be suicidal, because
Exactly.
there is never an authentic person from space that walks around and says, "I'm from this place" or "I'm from that place." We've got some charlatans that are running around that are
Mm.
publishing books and are making these claims, but but in reality, the real ones know that they have to be careful of our intelligence forces and all the other agencies that would be out for them. So they're
And I,
not stupid.
I want to go back to the aircraft that George has photographed, and I have seen a sphere shaped one, um, but I have never seen. I've seen a flying wing too, and I knew that was U.S. military. But I saw one of the big ones back when they had that chase across Illinois and into Wisconsin.
Hmm.
Um, 93, I think it was. I saw that one, but now the ones that are spherical are these. The only thing I can describe them as is when you see them, they kind of look like a what we would call a Merkaba spinning energy. Are
Yeah,
these?
yeah. Oftentimes these are what are called registering devices. This is their remote control, their version of a drone, where they can send that out and they can record information and collect it then for their database. And so the spherical ones are what we would call the luminescent greens and things like that are often uh, mechanical devices that are part of their technology.
It's really funny because here a couple years ago we had one that we saw. I saw it from my porch standing outside, and a friend of mine 30 miles away could see it as well. But it wasn't squared in between us. It was both for both of us. It was south of us, but it was so large and obvious. We got we got video of it,
Hmm.
and might put it up on YouTube. But I said, that is not a planet. I don't know what it is, and then it just vanished. Um,
Right.
and here in Cherokee, we have what we call the Cherokee lights. They're little globes that travel along the ground, and a lot of people say it's a ball lightning.
Hmm.
But I had one go bouncing up my driveway. It's the first time I've ever had one over here on my mountain, and I don't want to call it my mountain, but it's the mountain that I live on. I've always seen them over on the ridge above me, which is probably about 1,500 feet above me. But I had one go right up my driveway, and it looked like about the size of a softball, and it was just one of those luminescent balls. And I said,
Yeah.
"Nope, I'm not going to call you. Thank you very much." But I never had any bad feelings from it. Like they talk about the will o' the wisp and things like that. This one just kind of seemed like it was checking me out, and then it went up the mountain and vanished.
Right. Well, because it's not, I think too, part of it is your own reaction. Your own reaction is not adverse to it. And so, whenever you act reasonably towards something, you usually get that in return. And I know that from the Native American lore that there's a lot of talk about that being spiritual or ancestral or what have you. And I think that, uh, each one has to determine for themselves uh, what the likelihood of things are. So, and then let it be at that.
I saw this one up close, and we have ancestral stories about the balls, um, and this one here, it was so close. I mean, literally, so I could have walked over and touched it. I think if it would have let me, but
Yeah.
I had no ill feelings from it. It just felt like a pleasant presence, a
Well, good.
curious maybe. I don't know.
Hmm.
Um, but now these interactions with people are there's a lot of people over the course of history that we can find that they have had visits that kind of directed them in a new direction. Um, do you can you speak to this?
I would say that, well, first, if we go back and we just take the Bible, for instance, there are probably 300 or 400 references
Yes.
to extraterrestrial craft. One, they would call that the wheel within the wheel with Ezekiel, or
Mhm.
the flying scroll, or the
Yes.
pillar of fire by night and a glowing cloud by day. There's a whole litany of these reports, and the reports are also outside the Bible as well. They're in Roman history, Greek history. Alexander reported seeing something in India in the water. So there's a lot of foundation for these crafts, and of course you have to realize as well that anything that came from the sky, you have to look at it within the tenure of the time that it was seen and reported. We didn't have airplanes then, and so anything that flew in the sky had
Hang on just a second. We lost your audio. I don't like this interference. Try it again, Glenn. No. Folks, we are having trouble, but I'm going to pursue this because this is an amazing conversation.
Are we
Keep trying.
back?
There you are. There you are.
Okay. Okay. And so anything that came from the sky, the only way they could depict it coming from the sky was to give it wings. And
Yes.
so that's why all the angelic paintings, whether that happens to be Renaissance or any time else, or in the top of the Sistine Chapel or throughout the different religious organizations, these individuals that came from the sky all had wings, cherubs. And so, but that doesn't mean that they had wings sprouting out from between their shoulders. People, once again, they're unfortunately, we spend so much time with the subjects that mean absolutely nothing, like who's wearing what, who's going where, who's buying what $1 million car, blah blah blah. All these things fascinate us, and the so-called reality TV, which to me is about as unrealistic as it should get.
Oh,
And we
yes.
don't spend any time educating the people on things that are actually real and things that are actually true. And we have to also blame the people to some degree because they don't want it either. They say, well, I'm bored.
Yeah.
So it's a struggle no matter where you look at it.
Well, now, we also have stories from East India and from China of direct contact with people that had flying crafts that could just vanish before their eyes.
Right. I believe that the Tibetan scripts talk about the first 7 kings of Tibet having come from the sky and could return there anytime they wanted to. The Chinese, 4,000, 5,000 years ago, talked about the aerial surveying from thousands of feet up of the ground below and doing it accurately.
Yes.
So much of our history is suppressed, like the
Well,
map. Like the map that Columbus used to, that already showed the South American coast and the Caribbean and everything else.
oh, yeah, and Antarctica.
Yeah. Hmm.
Another thing too that frustrates me is like some writings that had references to it, like the Golden Emperor's writings. If somebody's not my age and didn't get a hold of some of that stuff from China in the early '90s, you try to find a reference to the Golden Emperor's full books. You almost can't anymore.
No, because we have all, no matter what society we point our finger at, I mean, we are not a democracy and we are not a republic, no matter how we try to poison people's thinking. We operate just as nasty as all the other countries, no matter whether they're communists or capitalists or whatever, socialists, whatever we want to call them. And so information becomes, we live in an age where we believe there is more information, but in a way there's just as much misinformation. So it's kind of a 50-50 split, and you've got to figure out what's going on. If I go onto Wikipedia and type in George Adamski, they have nothing but propaganda on there. And they had a vehicle upon which you could submit contrary information as long as you could provide the data behind it. And I submitted it twice. They erased me twice. I sent
Yes.
it to other people in the country to submit it under their name. They erased that as well. So there's a very definitive program to control information, to make it sure that it's just the information somebody else wants you to have.
Well, and there's this difference between information and knowledge as well.
Well, yeah, that's true.
Um, so why do you think, after all these years, they still so adamantly attack George?
Because for one very outright reason, he spoke of human beings coming from other planets, and George made a statement. He says, if I wanted to make these contacts come from another solar system or somewhere else in space, my life could have been so much easier because we would have absolutely no way in the foreseeable future to go there and prove it or disprove it.
Hmm.
right? But he said that wasn't the truth of his contacts. His contacts were with people from this planets in our solar system. And we are fighting that night and day and day and night. If George had just taken pictures of UFOs and not talk about the people and the information that he interacted with, they would have loved him. But we are with every particle of our being fighting that there is life beyond this planet nearby.
Yeah. We know, you've got all these different people that are talking about going to Mars. And, I look at it and I just laugh. It's like there are already people there. The images that they give us most of the time are boogered up and blocked out, and they use graphics over them and things like that. But um,
The face on Mars with Petrie and Molinar came across those images in 19, I believe it was 77. The Viking was scheduled to land on the plains of Sidonia. And when those images came out and those spectral analographs of those images showed a definitive face with definitive eyes, nose, and mouth,
mhm,
immediately Carl Sagan ordered Viking to change its landing spot from Sidonia to a completely more desolate area that was more rocky. And the scientists complained and said this is going to cause the lander to be destroyed because there's no soft landing spot. And they tried to cover up that face on Mars as much as possible. But yet, if you look at the book that came out with Crawley, that was in the mid 80s. My father was in Australia lecturing in Brisbane in the university, and he met with one of the authors, Crawley. And Crawley said, not only do we have data and photos of past civilizations, ancient structures on Mars, but of current ones too. He said, and there wasn't a publisher on the planet that was willing to take the book on and publish it. They
yeah.
finally found one in Australia, and then the heat came on so much that the publisher refused the second printing.
Well, I remember the active tunnels and what was obvious mechanical structures.
Yeah, Sharpelli. Mm-hmm.
They just buried them so
Well,
quickly.
I think to a certain degree, like we admit, in 1963, George said in print that there is an abundance of salt water on Mars. Well, about 5 years ago, guess what? NASA reveals there's salt water on Mars. Another case in which Adamski was once again 100% spot on. But
Well, now,
they admit that there's enough water on Mars underground that it could cover the surface of the entire planet, what I think 50 feet. So I personally think that when Sharpelli viewed the so-called Martian canals, they were in actuality constructions to move water from the poles to the more arid regions. But the difference between their canal construction and ours, if you go out into the deserts here of California, all the canals and reservoirs are open on top. So you have 60, 70% evaporation from the sun. And in their place, they thought it much more, uh, 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 what is the word I'm looking for, efficient to cover the
yeah,
canals up so that they would retain more of the water and not just let it evaporate.
exactly. Um, well, did George ever talk about people living on some of these larger moons as well?
I think that there was some discussion. There's a discussion that that Phoebos and Mars is an artificial satellite, and that's not just George. I have the article from the Russian satellite scientists who say that it is a very large asteroid that was towed into the Martian atmosphere because it's in an unstable orbit, which it normally would not be able to sustain. It's an unusual shape, and from what I've been heard, that there is artificial construction within that particular artificial moon. And as far as the other moons are concerned, well, you look at the moons of Saturn and in Jupiter. I mean, the moons are bigger than our entire planet, and
Yes.
there's dozens of them. So I would say that there is a likelihood, yeah, that there are some type of construction or inhabitants on those lunar structures, just like we have on our moon. We have
Yeah.
not only our own military has its own bases on the moon already from 57 to 67. Uh, Major Coruscant talked about Project Rainbow, which was in order to put a permanent facility in the moon and to have it up and operational before Apollo got there. I have a letter from an ex-astronaut that came here in 1984 to my father that described the secret Mercury X project or Mercury 10 project, in
Yeah.
which the astronauts were trained to go to the moon for 8 years. Well, how the heck do you think they would have survived there?
Well, the X project is a long story in and of itself, but the thing that I always found interesting is that there's this argument about the photographs and Kubrick's filming, and I always said, look, just because you have all this fakery doesn't mean that they didn't really go. It's just that they didn't want to show you what they were doing.
Well, first of all, Kubrick was asked if he thought that he could duplicate it, and he thought it might be possible. He never said definitively that it was, and he
Yes,
never he never validated that accusation. And
I know.
secondly, when you look at the pictures, and I have looked at tens of thousands of pictures and frame upon frame of motion picture footage, there is
Hmm.
absolutely no doubt. Then we went to the moon, and I confronted these anti-moon people, and I said, "You are aware that when Apollo took off, that it was tracked by ground-based telescopes, not only amateur from regular people, but from the astronomers and professionals, all the way to the moon, and the Mount Palomar 200-inch telescope took a picture of the Sea of Tranquility landing site in which you can see the equipment parked there from the lunar module." And
Yes.
so then they start backing off a little bit and said, well, maybe the craft went, but there was nobody in it. I said, make up your mind what kind of story you're going to fabricate.
What I always told
Here,
them,
here's
what
the
I go ahead, go ahead.
here's the legitimacy of it. These people who claim that we didn't go to the moon are entirely ignorant of the conditions on the moon. First of all, the moon has 65% gravity of Earth, not one
Hmm.
sixth. 65%. It's provable through mathematics, and it's provable by the L1 or the neutral gravity point between the Earth and the moon. Now, this greater gravity also maintains more of an atmosphere. It's not Palm Beach, but there's a very thin atmosphere that moves along the moon, and it has pressure gradients, which means that there is a lunar wind. And that lunar wind is what makes the flag flap in the wind.
Hmm.
It has
You know
nothing to do with a studio. Then you
what?
have astronaut Young, who weighs 180 pounds, has a 180-pound space pack on, 360 pounds, and can only jump 22 centimeters off the ground,
Hmm.
which is about a foot and 3 inches. Right? And so that shows you that the lunar gravity is stronger. It shows you that there's mist. We have record of lunar geysers spraying from 7 to 14 hours. We just found out, and I have this article for the book, I love it, that they are Goldilocks zones on the moon. We have admitted ourselves, our own scientists, where the temperature is a constant 63 degrees Fahrenheit.
Sweet.
Well, hell, that's
That's
just like here in some places. Now you add atmosphere, water, 63 degrees Fahrenheit, and you wonder that there may not be some life that develops from that. Of course it does.
the other thing too that I always point out with some of the we had a lot of fakery that went on, and we had a lot of photographs that came out, and you're like, wait a second here. But I always had to point out to folks, look, if they had an X project that far back, do you think that they're going to show you everything that they're doing? No,
No,
because
of course not.
you know, and to produce, even if they produced fake photographs in order to distract people, that's part of their modus operandi. Um, you know, but I have never said that, and people get mad at me. Yeah, I get grief too. I say, hey, look, we went to the moon. Whether or not the images that you saw are accurate, all the images that you saw are accurate or not is irrelevant. They don't want you to know what they've been doing up there since 1957.
Yep, that's true. Absolutely true. So,
Do our
but
listeners?
I would say that the astronauts themselves, when Buzz Aldrin and especially Neil Armstrong got to the moon, remember there's that audio clip supposedly where he says to Houston Control that there were huge ships there, enormous ships, and there are others here besides us, and
I love
he
that.
just
I love that famous line that they always try to edit out. There's somebody walking toward me.
right, yeah,
So
exactly, and so I think that there's more than enough evidence that we did go to the moon, and significant materials we brought back, lunar material and soils, and so I mean the whole thing is manufactured, and there
about the
was
glass,
never any reality to it. That is not true whatsoever.
structures that they picked up on imagery.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely.
One of them looked like it was damaged, and then the other one looked like a solid glass dome. And
Hmm.
obviously, done that. Um,
Well, there's a lot there was more constructions on the front side of the moon, like Gassendi crater and Tycho and Archimedes, and these craters, the Straight Wall, the Alpine Valley. These are all areas that if you have your own telescope, you can look at. You look long enough, you'll see something too.
mhm.
And so, but a lot of it has moved to the backside of the moon, and and people think that's the dark side of the moon, and they don't realize that for 14 days out of the month, the backside of the moon is as lit as the front side. So half the time it's lit and half the time it's dark. And
It's kind of
so
like the South or North Pole in the summer or winter.
that's
Um,
right.
or it's monthly. Now, here's the other thing too. A lot of people don't talk about this, but we have forever seen things in the sky, and we try to differentiate for people between the cigar shaped and the round and the saucer shaped. But now let's talk about propulsion, because that was one of the major things that I always took away from George's description was the electromagnetic propulsion.
Yeah, that's correct. And basically, the ships, the scout ship or the bell-shaped craft is a very old type of craft. And the reason that they came with that type of craft in the 40s and 50s is because it matches the description that is given in our ancient texts. And
Hmm.
so the relationship to those observations were more prevalent. They have a newer, and the bell-shaped craft can only be brought to a planet through the mothership, like an aircraft carrier,
Hmm.
where the newer ship, which is lenticular shaped, is capable of carrying crew from planet to planet without the mothership.
Oh,
But the bell-shaped craft works on electrostatic energy, and the large ship that travels between planets works on electromagnetic
uh,
energy. And
gotcha.
so what happens is, to make it a simple analysis, if you take a stone and drop it into a calm patch of water, you will see the rings radiate out from the impact into the water. The rings go out. Well, those rings are exactly like the rings of energy that emanate from the planet.
Hmm.
So the Earth has these rings that go outward, and those rings are traveling at up to the speed of magnetism, faster than the speed of light.
Yes.
And the craft merely merges, what they call prime merge. They merge with that lane of energy and allow that energy, like a current or a mountain stream, to carry it along at the speed that it's going until it reaches the waves that come from another planet, and they tune that frequency there and then ride it inbound towards the next planet. And
Nice.
so they skip from planet to planet by riding these lanes of energy of magnetic force.
Now, can they do that with solar magnetics too?
I I don't know about the solar winds because everything has a particular charge. Like for instance, First of all, people have to realize that the sun does not give off heat, it gives off radiation.
Yes.
Because if the sun gave off heat, the temperature of space would get warmer as you got closer to the sun, and it doesn't do that. The sun gives off radiation. These waves of radiation have to impact an atmosphere in order to be turned into heat in order
Yes.
to be on the planet. So that is our first misnomer that we teach the people, that is not heat and energy. The waves that come from the sun have a particular charge, and it's opposite that of the planet. So let's say the planet is a positive charge. The solar rays are a negative charge, and like a magnet are pulled together,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so it attracts one another, and that's how you'll note that the planets get an amount of radiation that is necessary for their sustainability. Also, the radiation accelerates through the asteroid belt. The asteroid belt is like a booster. And
Mm-hmm.
so when those rays hit the asteroid belt, they accelerate once again up to the equal speed they did when they came from the sun, and then they saturate the 4 planets that are behind there. Also note, the farther you get away from the sun, the bigger the planets are in order to attract more radiation as well.
Yes. Yes.
Right? And so they are using what is called natural energy, natural principle to travel. For them to use a rocket, we are now saying, well, in the next 5 years, we'll build an atomic rocket to get us to Mars,
That's crazy.
right? But we do not shield the spacecraft. All the other spacecrafts have a band, a force field around it, because when you travel at these speeds, the smallest molecule of meteorite or cosmic dust will punch a hole right through that. And so we are playing with half antique stuff and half new technology. In other words, it's absolutely ridiculous that the astronauts up there in the space station are in zero gravity, because all they have to do is put some boosters on there and rotate the station at a certain speed, and then the astronauts would have gravity inside the ship.
Yes. Well, I never have understood because I mean they obviously can build some large gravity banks like the LHC, and to me the LHC would be the most awesome launch for a ship. You could use that extra magnetic field that has been generated to launch with.
Mm-hmm.
It just makes sense to me.
Well, don't believe we are not launching with that stuff on other parts of the planet that are less visible.
Ah,
So while
yes.
we have a public space program that is operated out of Texas and Florida, that doesn't mean that's the only space program we've got going on.
Oh, that's true. Now we've been going for an hour and a half, and I have to ask you. Now you spent a long time as a pilot. Did you ever have any up close encounters while you were flying?
Sure, absolutely. I was flying south out of the United States to Buenos Aires. And the right of flight takes you just to the east of Panama, over Colombia and
Hmm.
over Ecuador. And from Ecuador down for about 600 miles or so, you follow along the eastern rim of the Andes and the western side of the Amazon jungle.
Yes.
And there is not a light to be seen for hundreds and hundreds of miles. I
It's
mean,
beautiful.
total desolation. And one night I watched a device that was almost octagonal shaped, glowing pulsating, come out of the jungle, hover, and then slowly start accelerate and tilt up and then shoot up into space.
Wow.
And another time we were going to Europe, and we were on what's called the North Atlantic Track System,
Hmm.
and we were to the north of it because of the weather, and up towards Gander, towards the middle of Greenland. And we watched a ship come out from literally from behind the moon. The moon was like a half moon in the windshield. And we watched as this glowing object came from behind it out in front, looked like it was accelerating towards us, and then tilt up and go back up into space. And I said to the other two crew members, I said, well, what the heck do you think that was? And none of them made any comment.
Well, as a pilot, you know how difficult. I've got some friends that were pilots, and they always talked about you don't report these things unless it
That's
looks like
right.
a collision problem.
That's right. They had one famous United guy in the 70s who reported one of these craft to NORAD, and the company grounded him for a year without pay and the government made him go through psychiatric evaluations and all kinds of things. When you think about how many UFO trackings the NORAD must do in a day, I
Yes,
mean, what kind of hypocrisy is that?
exactly. Now that's the other question that we probably ought to address while we're talking about this. Now, are these craft all traceable as far as our equipment goes?
Well, I would say that things that are in our atmosphere is traceable by the Space Command,
Yeah.
because remember, Space Command is maintaining a surveillance on satellites, on orbital platforms. There's about 6,000 to 7,000 pieces of space space debris that is
Yes.
left over from all our space programs and things like that. That is orbiting the Earth at thousands of miles an hour, and if something like that hits you, it's not a pretty picture.
Yeah.
So
Folks, for y'all that don't know what we're talking about, the space monitoring program. There's debris up there, and every once in a while they will actually have to move various satellites and the space station. They'll actually have to use propulsion to move it in order to avoid a collision.
correct. So obviously they have the ability, radar wise, to track that, and of course we have little to no knowledge what kind of space based platforms we have up there with lasers and all kinds of other equipment that the public doesn't get to be privy to.
Yeah.
But so I would say that, yeah, we can track that. The difference is that if they don't want to be tracked, these spaceships, they can move at speed so fast because they do not experience gravitational forces. They're totally protected within the force field. So for instance, in areas where there is no radar coverage from the surface, like over the Pacific Ocean or over some areas where there are not any ground-based stations due to the inhabitable conditions, then we have what is called a non-radar environment. And I think in these areas, they find it going in and out of a lot easier because nobody's tracking them, but they can literally come into our atmosphere and from orbit drop down to 50 feet above the surface within 2 seconds. And so that is much faster than what our equipment is able to track.
Yeah.
But to a large degree, I would say that we are very conscious of what is flying around up there. And there was not too long ago, in fact, last year, I got a call from a bunch of my compatriots that are still flying in multiple airlines. And there were a number of these craft that were reported in the airspace between Japan and Hawaii and between Hawaii and the mainland. A good friend of mine, who's a captain, saw him on multiple occasions. And so there were a few months where there was a heightened amount of activity. And who knows what kind of shenanigans we are in the middle of pulling politically here on the planet. So maybe they were watching those people. If you remember the 1964 Vandenberg missile launch, and you can look it up on YouTube as well. And what happened is that we had high-speed cameras to film the launch of the I think it was a Trident missile that was going to go out in the Pacific with a warhead. And that missile launched, and as it was accelerating through 14,000 miles an hour, the tracking station with the telescope, who was filming all of this, filmed a bell-shaped saucer flying alongside the missile at 14,000 miles an hour, flying around it in circles and shooting beams at the warhead until the missile disintegrated.
Yes.
And then there was the 67 incident in Montana in which several of these ships were seen over the nuclear missile silos and deactivated 10 of the missiles simultaneously.
And over in Russia, that we had the reports after the wall came down that their silos and their mobile units had encountered a UFO, and they had shut their systems down.
That's right. In fact, in 1989, when my father and I were at the UFO convention in Germany, a big one, the wall had just come down and there were some Soviet scientists there, and they came to us and they wanted to have a private talk, in which we did. And the private talk had to do with decommissioned military bases that were reinstated as landing sites for these craft if they wanted to come and land peacefully. And the Russian military was ordered to not shoot at them under any circumstance. And the one general that ignored the order was immediately retired. And so, oh yeah, there's a whole lot going on people don't know about.
One more question for you, and then I'm going to let you go. And Glenn, I so appreciate your time. Folks are going to absolutely enjoy this look at George and his work and the things that have continued. There is a zone in Russia that still to this day nothing can fly over. It knocks out all the electronics. They don't even try to get military in there, and people who go into that area still get sick. Um, do you think that is related to former visitors that we've had, or is it maybe a?
That's us. We have the same thing in the Pacific. If you pull out an aeronautical chart for the Pacific Ocean between the Hawaiian Islands and Japan, you have the Johnson's Atoll that used to be a nuclear test range and biological weapons experiment. And there's some other areas, and you will see that there are circular plots in there which are strictly forbidden from flyover. And it's because due to sources that I had talked to, along with those in Russia, and we have some other land-based ones here in the U.S. as well, that we experiment with microwave particle beam weapons and accelerators and lasers and vibratory magnetic beams and things like that. Our technology is much greater than what we admit to. What people see today, technology-wise, was developed at least 15, 20 years ago. So the public is 20 years behind where currently things are. And I think that these areas, they don't have anything to do with extraterrestrials because they have the ability to control their technology where we don't. We're in experimental phase, and we shoot beams at the moon and all kinds of other things into space, and we experiment. I mean, so I would say that this is our stuff, and you have to be careful because if you fly into it, there are some severe negative health repercussions involved.
Well, and negative mechanical and
Oh yeah,
electrical.
well yeah. It affects the aircraft systems, the instrumentation, all kinds of things like that, and that has to do with I would say has to do with electromagnetic experimentations where we are, we love to play with things to see what happens. I mean, we have the movie Oppenheimer out there now. I mean, I had a very good friend of mine who had worked for the aerospace industry who had witnessed these UFOs landing on George's property. And you couldn't tell him that didn't exist because he knew 100%. In fact, he wrote to the Pentagon and to the president and everybody. But anyway, he was part of the military troop that was surrounding the first nuclear explosion, where we made our own troops march into ground zero to see what the effects of the radiation would be.
Horrible. Well,
Horrible.
now, one last question, and then I'm going to let you go. If you had to tell people how George really was, and your father too, I want to include him in this because he spent years making sure that people could still hear this story, and now you're doing the same thing. I admire that greatly. Could you give people a honest evaluation of George as far as who he was and how he was? Because I never found anything about anything that he ever said to be disingenuous.
That's true. And I never found anything that he ever said to be inaccurate or untrue. George Adamski was a contact for the space people. They chose him specifically after vetting him and watching him for decades, and they found him to be an ethical, moral, and highly truthful person. And so they entrusted upon him the information that he would eventually carry to the governments. They gave him the sealed message, which he delivered to the Pope John the 23rd at the Vatican in May of 1963, I believe it was, 2 weeks before the Pope died, in which the church received this information as well. He was an emissary with Queen Juliana in the Netherlands. There was nothing fake or clandestine or two-faced about the man whatsoever.
Nice.
And he worked his tail off for little to no compensation. His lectures in other countries, you didn't make a dime off of it. It was not legal to give lectures and to make profits from. Half of his copyrights to his books that were published in other countries and other languages were done without royalties of any sort. Show me one UFO author today that would act in such a authentic manner. And
Well,
so that's
he
why
worked.
they go after George the most, because they try to knock down that which is so different from what they represent. And I would say he taught my father extremely well the same principles, and gave him access to those that my father recognized and knew people that came from other worlds. And there was not, like I told you, not a single thing that could shake his foundation. It's the same thing for me. I understand people are skeptical, and I
Yeah.
understand we live in an age of misinformation and everybody has to be careful. And I invite them to take a look at material, and I try to present both sides of something so people can make up their own mind. My father's last lecture in San Diego in 91, before he passed away, he opened it by telling the people, he said, "I'm not here to convince you. I'm here simply to present information that we've had the privilege of being exposed to, and you have to decide whether it's applicable or justifiable for yourself. You never want to take away people's individual thinking."
Mm.
And that's what is going on in this UFO thing now. Everybody wants to tell you what you should think, their interpretation of it, and that's not right. And I have
So,
to say, my father was very loyal and very authentic, and the same thing. He worked his tail off in his profession, and he used his days off and his vacation days to go and give addresses and sometimes lecture in foreign countries. And so I can only say I've done the same thing myself. They set the example, and I could do no less.
there you go. Now, for folks that don't know, is it not true that George washed dishes until the day that he died?
Well, no, I wouldn't say that he washed dishes. What happened is that when the property in 1945 was bought up at Mount Palomar, the
Hmm.
beginnings of the Mount Palomar telescope and astronomical villages was in the process of construction. And so
Uh-huh.
the lady who owned the property, Alice Wells. George never owned any of these properties. When George died, he had 2 suits to his name and like $2,000 in his bank account and no estate. Anybody who claims that George Adamski got rich off of this is an absolute moron. They can
That
look at the county records themselves. So
that's what I
anyway,
point to folks.
so Alice put up the restaurant there to have a place for the astronomers and scientists to stop, have a cup of coffee, grab a sandwich, whatever. And that also helped them financially with the development of the property as well, because they had a school there and cabins and what have you. And so they live just like the Israelis live on a kibbutz. If the dishes need to be washed, somebody washed it. If somebody needs to cook a hamburger, they cooked it. It's like I said to my friends, I said, they claim Adamski was a hamburger and hot dog cooker. I said, well, you know what? I've been flying airplanes for 45 years of my life all over this planet. And when I have friends over and have a barbecue and cook some hamburgers, does that mean now I'm a lousy pilot because I cook some hamburgers?
Very, very, very good analogy. I just wanted the people to understand that he didn't make he didn't make a fortune. He did not die wealthy, and he dedicated most of his the end of his life to just communicating this message. And I find that just not only admirable, but it's very telling of his character.
I think so, and I think also to to be a proponent of the truth. One of the space people once said, "Learn to love the truth above all else."
Yes.
And I think that that's a very viable statement, because whether it's convenient for you or not, whether it causes you personal distress or not, like my father said, it is not the truth that is hurtful, it's the sudden realization of it.
Yeah.
And so I think that to stand for the truth, no matter what the ridicule, means that you have to have a very strong foundation within yourself. Personally, if people believe me or not, really doesn't make any difference to me whatsoever. I know the experiences I've had. I know the presence of the people I've been in with. I know where they come from. They proved it to me many, many times over. And there is nothing that can possibly shake my conviction. But I understand that other people do not have the same experiences and therefore are somewhat fragmented, and they're unsure. And I understand that. But what I try to do is give people an area to look at, informational source that may help them. And like you said, for a while you put this away, and then all of a sudden it came back to you. It came back to you for a reason.
Yes. Absolutely. Now, before we quit, let them know about the foundation and where they can find your books on that website.
Okay, it's under Adamski, ADAMSKI Foundation, one word.com. Or you can type in my name. If in fact, if you type in my name in YouTube, you will find there are probably a dozen YouTube programs that I've done in the last 6 months that that will include some of the motion picture film from George. Some of the original photographs were on share screen, so they will get more of a visual reference, but they can find the materials on the foundation website. They can find an awful lot of information on the foundation website as well. And they can find them with the other book companies I mentioned, Amazon, ABE, and eBay. So I encourage everybody to take for a minute and think what it takes to travel deep space. Traveling space, when you go out and you just go on your computer and pull up photos from the Hubble telescope, and you will see that the pictures we've taken are totally saturated with galaxies, solar systems, universes, everything. I mean, hundreds of trillions, and that's only 2 square inches of it. Think of the technology that's required to travel those distances successfully. And then think of the development of the people who are piloting those crafts, because they also have to advance in thinking as they advance in technology, just like we have. And then you will understand that nobody comes here to do you harm. This is so contrary. So the only way that that story can be sold to you is by making it into creature features, because we are so used to science fiction and horror movies and programs in which all these creatures are there to scare the living daylights out of you, either devour you, skin you, have sex with you, whatever the heck. They come up with everything they can possibly pull out of a hat. And so consequently, just think about it logically, and you will come to the realization that there is an immense cosmos out there that we should be participating in. And
Mhm.
stop sitting on a little stump on our planet theorizing about what things are somewhere else. We need to go there. And that means all of us, not some of us. We need an open space program that allows us to see for ourselves.
Yes. I think that would expand the minds of everyone who had the opportunity.
You bet.
Glenn, thank you very, very much for taking the time and spending it with me. I will get this thing posted as quickly as I can, and of course, I will shoot you the links, folks. The links to the foundation and Glenn's name and all the stuff that I can put up will be in the description. And I hope you get something from this conversation. I really do. Thank you, Glenn.
Well, thank you very much. And I look forward to doing it again anytime you want to.